He leans over the bomb site. 23,000 feet above Bavaria, the oxygen mask hisses, frost crawling along the edge of the lens like veins beneath skin. Below, the city of Schweinfurt glimmers through haze, the heart of Germany's ball-bearing empire. Somewhere inside those factories, the Wehrmacht keeps the war turning. Bombs away. The B-17 jolts upward, 12,500 pounds lighter. 30 seconds later, the blossoms appear, orange flashes blooming across empty fields miles from target. He blinks once, then again, and realizes the miracle has missed. 228 bombers flew this mission, 19 hit anything close. 8%. Precision, they called it. Precision wrapped in propaganda. The bomb site had been sold as a revelation, a mechanical prophet that could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 6 miles up. It weighed 37 pounds, full of gyros, mirrors, and the arrogance of perfection. The arsenal of democracy guarded it like a holy object. Every bombardier swore to destroy it before capture. But altitude rewrites every promise. At 25,000 feet, wind bends equations the way heat bends steel. The sight trembles under the strain, the crosshair shivering as if it feels doubt. He adjusts a knob by instinct more than science, hoping the air will behave. Through the frosted glass, he sees his own eyes reflected, wide, uncertain, human. The mask fogs. He wipes it clear. The reflection remains. For a moment he wonders whether the real target is below or inside. What happens when the weapon you trust begins to doubt you back? Briefings had promised a circle of error no wider than 1,000 feet. The kind of pledge that sounds like certainty when traced on paper maps. Combat gave them 3,200 feet instead, a difference large enough to spare an entire plant while punishing the fields around it. On the ground, that discrepancy reads as mathematics. In the air, it reads as names added to a board. He runs a gloved finger along the frame of the sight. The glass is no longer merely cracked, it is cold and alive, a thin skin between belief and panic. The navigator calls wind from the drift meter. Quartering out of the west at nearly 90 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, a bomb can hang for almost 60 seconds before it meets the earth. In that minute, the air shoves it sideways more than a mile. No lens can see that push. Only consequences can. The fortress groans as the pilot keeps formation. To hit at all, you must fly straight long enough for the sight to settle. But straight flight invites the batteries of the Wehrmacht to paint you with mathematics of their own. 88mm shells burst in careful ladders, black flowers gridding the sky. Each blossom is timed by a predictor, a machine that calculates where a bomber will be if it wishes to aim. Precision meets precision, and the man trapped between them is the one who bleeds. The interphone crackles with clipped prayers and swearing. 50 caliber guns in the waist and top turret cough brass that skitters into the nose like sleet on metal. Vibrations creep into every bone. He steadies the trembling crosshair and watches it drift, even when the aircraft holds level, as if the air itself were a tide. Below, the Ruhr unwinds in gray threads of river and rail. The bomb site wants angles and speed, values, not feelings. Yet what his eyes report are not numbers. It is the sway of the fuselage when Flak walks toward them, the way the horizon tips when a Messerschmitt flashes past the formation. The taste of cordite and cold in the mask. Those are not variables a gearbox can carry. A burst goes off close. The nose shudders. The sight blinks. For a heartbeat, the frost on the lens blooms into a white flower and then vanishes. He thinks of the briefing officer's marker pen drawing a neat circle on a neat map. 1,000 feet promised like a benediction. Up here, the circle is ragged and moving. Up here, the circle answers to the wind. Another run begins. The pilot calls steady. The bombardier answers steady. The navigator feeds one more correction that will be out of date before the bomb bay doors finish opening. He breathes with the engines now, counts the rhythm to keep his hands from shaking. The crosshair floats like a leaf over water. He does not fight it this time. He watches where it wants to go. Tracer reaches for them again. The Luftwaffe is out there, but it feels almost secondary compared to the air itself. Fighters can be outflown, avoided, outgunned. The sky cannot be. It must be understood. He remembers an instructor's joke from stateside schoolhouses that the sight was clever enough to put a bomb into a pickle barrel from 6 miles up. He wonders whether the instructor had ever seen a barrel drift downstream. Down here, the rivers are brown and slow. Up here, the rivers are invisible and fast. He opens his fist and finds crescent marks where the frame pressed into his glove. He is learning something he cannot yet name. The numbers everyone trusts must be bent to the wind that no one commands. If the air is going to shove the bomb a mile and more, perhaps the aim should begin a mile and more against that shove. Not to cancel it, to use it. Another blossom of flak swells and wets. The pilot asks for a check. He answers with a calm he does not feel. The trembling crosshair steadies for a long, impossible moment, not because the air has calmed, but because he has chosen to ride with it. The formation rolls into sun. The frosted sight catches a thin blade of light and splits it in two. For a breath he sees the target and the place beside the target, twinned like choices. He files the vision away the way a soldier hides a letter in his boot. He does not have proof. He has a suspicion shaped like a question. What if the path to the target begins somewhere else? A place the wind can translate into truth. Winter came early in 1943. The North Sea storms reached across England, and the barracks of the 8th Air Force smelled of damp wool and fear. The chalkboard in the briefing hut never stayed clean. Each day, the eraser left ghosts of names that would not return. They were losing crews faster than they could learn their own call signs. Coffee froze in tin mugs. Officers talked about statistical variance, but the gunners called it what it was, dying by arithmetic. 1 in 4 finished a tour. The rest went down in smoke over the continent or vanished in the channel. The word precision had become a joke whispered in the blackout. Inside the ready room, the sighting glass sits on the table, fogged and cracked. Someone has etched a small cross on its rim, part superstition, part reminder. The weapon once guarded like a relic now feels like a confession. The men still polish it out of habit, but no one believes the promises carved into the manuals. Each raid grows heavier, longer routes, colder altitudes, denser flak. At 25,000 feet, frost climbs the inside of the plexiglass nose. The interphone crackles with half-heard prayers. He watches a formation lose its symmetry when one bomber disintegrates, pieces tumbling through sunlight like coins dropped from heaven. No geometry can describe that fall. He dreams of the wind at night. In the dream, it has a voice, a dry whisper threading through the cracks of the window pane, repeating a single idea, "Stop fighting me." He wakes with the echo still in his chest, unsure whether it is madness or instruction. By December, the mission reports begin to use new phrases: unacceptable dispersion, loss of concentration. The analysts try to fix the numbers. The crews try to fix their faith. Neither succeeds. During one flight, a near miss shakes the plane so hard, the bombsight jars loose. He catches it before it hits the floor, holds it close, and notices something strange. The crack running across the lens lines, up with the drift of the wind outside. He stares at it for a long moment. Maybe it is coincidence. Maybe it is direction. Back on the ground, he sketches the angle on a scrap of map paper, the line of fracture, the line of drift, and folds it into his pocket. The act feels private, almost treasonous. To suggest that the flaw could hold the key would sound insane. Yet the thought refuses to leave. Every time he looks at the site, the crack seems to lean the same way the bombs fall, the same way the wind insists on turning them. Maybe the problem is not that they keep missing. Maybe they are missing in the wrong direction. He breathes out slowly, tracing the angle with his thumb. The glass is cold against his glove, but the idea underneath it burns. For the first time, he begins to suspect that the sky is not mocking them at all. It is trying to teach. What if salvation hides inside the very drift that destroys us? The second raid on Schweinfurt was supposed to redeem the first. Instead, it became another massacre. 291 bombers launched that October morning. 60 never returned. 17 more came home so torn apart they would never fly again. A 26% loss rate, and almost nothing to show for it. But buried in the after-action reports was a single line that didn't fit the pattern. One formation, the 305th Bomb Group, had come in from the wrong direction. Their navigator, Captain Robert Williams, had miscalculated the wind correction by a full 40 degrees. By the time the lead pilot realized the mistake, the formation was already committed. Turning 18 heavy bombers in the middle of a Flak corridor was suicide. Williams made a decision that no manual had ever sanctioned. He told his bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Murphy, to use the crosswind knobs on the Norden sight, but to aim off target, deliberately, into the empty space east of the factory roofs. Murphy hesitated, then obeyed. At 25,000 feet, the wind from the west was screaming close to 90 miles per hour. He offset his crosshair to open sky, thumbed the release, and watched 12,000 pounds of explosives fall into nothing, except they didn't fall into nothing. They drifted sideways through the air, a full mile of invisible motion, and landed dead center in the factory complex. The strike cameras caught it all. While most groups that day recorded the usual 8 to 12% accuracy, the 305th achieved 42% hits inside the target zone. Analysts first called it luck, a fluke of turbulence and chance. But Williams refused to let the matter drop. He spent the night with his maps and wind logs, running the geometry backward. The more he checked, the clearer it became. The mistake had not been an error. It had been a correction the Norden could never make. At high altitude, the sight assumed one simple truth, that bombers attacked directly into the wind, either fighting a headwind or riding a tailwind. The device could calculate forward drift perfectly, but it was blind to sideways motion. Over Germany, the wind almost never cooperated. It came from the side, shoving entire formations off course, even as they appeared to fly straight. Pilots compensated by pointing their noses into the wind, the crab angle, to maintain a straight ground track. But the bombs, once released, carried both the forward momentum and the sideways component of that crab. The sight's perfect trigonometry assumed the world beneath was still. The sky knew better. Williams realized that the harder crews fought the wind, the worse their aim became. They were fighting physics with faith. What if, he thought, the wind could be turned into an ally? If you entered the target run at an angle to the wind, 40 or 50 degrees off, and aimed perpendicular to your flight path, you could let the drift itself carry the bombs home. Aim wrong on purpose, and hit dead right. It was counterintuitive, almost heretical. Every rule of precision bombing said face the target head-on. Williams' math said, forget the target, trust the wind. He drew the vectors on his clipboard, one for speed, one for wind, one for gravity. Where they met was not on the target, but beside it. That offset point, that invisible triangle of air, was the real aiming mark. He brought the data to Murphy, who stared at the figures in silence before laughing once, dryly. "So you're telling me," he said, "we missed right because we aimed right?" Williams only nodded, because the truth was impossible and undeniable at the same time. The path to precision had begun with a mistake, and a gust of wind that refused to behave. The reports from Williams and Murphy traveled slowly, passed from desk to desk, buried under official language. But the photographs spoke for themselves. Bomb craters laid out in perfect alignment with the crosswind, like a mathematical confession carved into the earth. Engineers at the 8th Air Force headquarters began to recheck their assumptions. The Norden sight, they realized, was not wrong. It was incomplete. It could compute speed, altitude, and gravity with flawless precision, yet ignored the most unpredictable variable in the sky, the wind's sideways push. So they began to draw new diagrams. Triangles of airspeed, drift, and wind velocity covered every chalkboard. A new phrase appeared in the manuals, double drift correction. It meant measuring not only how far the wind moved the aircraft, but how far it would move the bomb during its fall. The formula was simple, the execution brutal. At 25,000 feet, a bomb fell for nearly 60 seconds. If the crosswind held at 90 miles per hour, it would travel almost 1.5 miles sideways before impact. The new method required bombardiers to aim that far away from their target, a deliberate miss that trusted the air to finish the shot. The first tests looked insane. From the cockpit, the aiming point was empty countryside. Pilots joked that the engineers had gone mad, turning precision bombing into guesswork. But when the photographs came back, the disbelief turned to silence. The new technique cut the average miss distance from more than 3,000 feet to just over 1,200. Accuracy improved nearly threefold. The crews called it riding the wind. They learned to feel the drift, to sense it as naturally as pilots once felt lift in their fingertips. The best bombardiers became half mathematician, half artist, adjusting in fractions of a second, trusting intuition born from geometry. Through his frosted sight, the veteran watches the pattern tighten, bursts walking toward the target in neat rows. He no longer curses the wind. He counts with it. Each burst marks a correction written in smoke and fire. The air that once betrayed them now works beside them, carrying their mistakes into meaning. On the ground, engineers translate those same patterns into doctrine. They draw a clean triangle, label one side ground speed, another wind vector, the third offset angle. In the center, they write a single word, precision, not as the absence of error, but the mastery of it. For the first time, the wind has a number and a purpose. The bombers that once fought the sky now fly with it, their paths bending into accuracy. And somewhere between the crosshairs and the wind, precision becomes partnership. By February 20th, 1944, the rumor had become regulation. Headquarters issued Field Order 259, a document as dry as parchment and as revolutionary as fire. Its command was simple. Every crew would now calculate a deliberate offset before each bomb run. The discovery born from a mistake was about to become official doctrine. Retraining began overnight. Across East Anglia, hangars turned into classrooms. 12,000 men, bombardiers, navigators, instructors, sat hunched over chalkboards beneath the roar of idling engines. They filled the air with the scrape of pencils and the rustle of flight jackets. Equations once hidden in the notebooks of Robert Williams were now written 10 feet high on black paint and white dust. The process had no glamour. Each man had to learn to solve 3 triangles of wind and motion before breakfast. Instructors walked the aisles like priests in a new religion: ground speed, drift, offset, release point. Every solution began the same way, by trusting the air that once betrayed them. Out on the hard stands, bomber crews practiced under winter rain. A lead ship carried the only active bombsight. 5 wingmen followed its command, holding formation so tightly that their wings cut through each other's prop wash. When the lead bombardier pressed his toggle, 5 other thumbs moved in perfect echo. 6 bombers became one long equation moving through the sky. The old creed, every man his own sight, was gone. Now one bombsight guided the many. Coordination replaced individuality. Precision became a collective act. Some grumbled at the loss of autonomy, but the results silenced argument. Each week, the photographs showed tighter groupings, cleaner target patterns, fewer men lost to repetition of error. In a canvas tent behind the flight line, a sergeant sets a small wooden box on a desk. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lies the cracked sighting lens from Schweinfurt. No one throws it away. It stays there as a reminder of where this new knowledge began. A piece of broken glass that taught the world how to aim sideways. Field Order 259 spread through the 8th Air Force faster than rumor. By April, it had crossed the Channel to the Mediterranean, and from there to India and the Pacific. Everywhere the same principle held: accept the wind, measure the drift, and trust the math. The miracle had changed shape. It was no longer hidden inside a secret device or guarded behind a security oath. It lived in the minds of men who had learned to make peace with the sky. By spring 1944, the sky over England began to sound different. The radio chatter grew calmer, the formation calls more deliberate. Crews who once cursed the wind now spoke about it like an old companion whose moods they finally understood. The air had not softened, but the men had learned how to read it. Every mission now began with ritual precision. Briefing officers no longer shouted for faith in machinery. They spoke of angles, vectors, lead times. A flight of bombers could now fly 200 miles at 25,000 feet through 90-mile-per-hour crosswinds, and still arrive within seconds of plan. The wind was still chaos, but now it was charted chaos. The results came quietly, without celebration. Accuracy climbed from 11% to 27%. The number of sorties required for one successful hit fell by nearly 2/3. The losses dropped with them, not by miracle but by mathematics. Each improvement in the logbooks meant lives preserved in the air. Inside the lead bomber, the bombardier waits for the call. His crew trusts him the way they once trusted the bombsight. 6 ships in the formation follow his signal. 6 bombsights echo his release. The instant the toggles fall, 6 arcs of steel trace the same invisible geometry through the wind. He feels no elation when the bombs strike, just a slow, deep quiet, the kind that comes when the equation finally balances. The world below disappears into smoke, but the pattern is perfect. Precision no longer feels like ambition. It feels like atonement. In the debriefing room that afternoon, officers point at the photographs pinned to corkboard walls. The clusters are tight, circular, clean. Someone whistles low. No one cheers. They have learned that accuracy is not victory. It is discipline with a pulse. That night, the bombardier walks alone along the flight line. Engines tick as they cool. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out the fragment of the cracked sighting lens. The fracture catches the moonlight, scattering it into faint lines across his palm. He realizes the crack forms the same angle they now use for offset, 40 degrees, the number that changed everything. The discovery has become doctrine. The doctrine has become habit, and habit, in war, becomes faith. Not the blind kind that worships machines, but the quiet faith of men who have measured the wind and learned to live inside its logic. Somewhere above him, a cold front moves in from the North Sea. He looks up and traces its slow curl across the stars. He can almost see the vectors, the paths of drift drawn on the night. For the first time in a long while, he smiles, not at victory, but at understanding. The air no longer feels like an adversary. It feels like a teacher and in its lessons the bombers of the 8th Air Force have found their way back to themselves. The proof would not come from theory, but from the beaches. June 6, 1944. Dawn bled across the channel like light poured through smoke. Above the gray water flew nearly 1,500 American bombers, the largest single formation ever assembled. They carried 10,000 tons of explosives and the burden of a continent's hope. 2 beaches, 2 commands, 1 sky. Omaha and Utah lay only 20 miles apart, yet would tell opposite stories of faith and calculation. At both, the weather was the same, 10/10 overcast, gusting crosswinds from the southwest at 40 miles per hour. The difference lay in what the crews had been taught to trust. At Omaha, the order was caution. Clouds covered the target, and the pilots delayed release to spare the men already in landing craft below. 5 seconds became 10, then 15. In that time, the wind pushed the bomb line 300 yards inland. The explosions tore open fields instead of bunkers. German guns along the bluff survived untouched. When the assault waves hit the beach, the sand turned red. The price of mercy was measured in blood. At Utah, the method was different. The Pathfinder group had studied the offset diagrams born from Williams and Murphy's experiment. They aimed not at the coast, but at the sea, a mile off target, trusting the wind's sideways thrust to correct them. Bombs released into empty horizon arced silently forward and left, curving into the German positions exactly as predicted. 89% of the defenses vanished before the first landing craft touched shore. Men who expected hell found silence. From 25,000 feet, the contrast was visible even through the haze. One coastline burned with scattered fires. The other was smothered in black smoke, its gun emplacements gone. The bombardier watched the pattern through his sight. 2 sets of coordinates, 2 philosophies of precision. One fought the wind, the other learned from it. In the debriefing later, officers drew red and blue circles on the wall maps. Omaha's bombs fell short. Utah's walked perfectly along the wind vector. The numbers looked cold, yet every pilot in the room understood their meaning. The difference between 31% and 89% was not just accuracy. It was men alive to tell the story. The lesson spread across the Allied command before sunset. Offset bombing was no longer theory or rumor. It was the proof that physics and discipline had joined hands. A single angle of drift had rewritten the doctrine of war. He sat in the quiet after the mission, staring through the same sight that had once betrayed him over Schweinfurt. The lens was clearer now, but the memory of its fracture remained. He ran his thumb along the metal housing, feeling the vibration of the engines fade beneath him. They had learned to aim sideways, and in that sideways path they had found the straightest line to victory. Far below, the tide crept across the sand of two beaches. On one, men were still fighting for inches. On the other, they were walking ashore under a sky that had finally been solved. The air smelled of fuel and salt and completion. He looked down once more through the glass, and for the first time, saw the wind not as distortion, but as design. And in that design, he recognized the shape of everything they had endured to reach this dawn. The ledger of war is cruel and simple, columns of numbers that refuse to flatter anyone. After Normandy, those columns began to change. From January to December of 1944, the tonnage dropped on the Reich rose by 340%. Measured against earlier campaigns, accuracy climbed 190%. The circular error, probable that had wandered at 3,200 feet, now held near 1,100. On paper, it looked like arithmetic. In the air, it felt like breathing again. Offset doctrine did more than tighten patterns. It shortened wars inside the war. Targets that once demanded 3 separate raids could be erased in one. Commanders spoke of economy of force. Crews called it survival. A factor of 3 fewer sorties for the same effect. That translated into men kept out of the Flak corridors, engines kept out of fire, letters not written to mothers who waited by the door. At the group intelligence hut, pins on the map began to move faster, rail junctions vanished. Oil refineries burned until the Wehrmacht's panzers starved for fuel. Ball-bearing plants like Schweinfurt fell quiet. The Luftwaffe still rose to meet the bomber stream, but each month fewer fighters reached the formations. Without oil, a dogfight becomes a rumor. The photos told the rest. Tight circular clusters sat over aiming points that weeks earlier would have been luck. Runways were stitched with bomb lines straight as chalk. Marshalling yards looked as if a giant had dragged a rake through iron and stone. Intelligence officers wrote "good concentration" in red pencil, then underlined it, then stopped underlining it, because the phrase had become ordinary. Precision was no longer an event. It was the baseline. He studies one reconnaissance print with a magnifying glass, the way he once stared through a trembling crosshair. Where he expects scatter, he finds design. Where he once saw chance, he sees method. He thinks of the old joke about pickle barrels and 6 miles of sky, and realizes the joke has died of old age. In the mess that evening, no one toasts the numbers. They eat in a tired silence that only veterans understand. For them, the statistics are not abstractions. Each percentage point is a man at the card table who did not empty his locker. Each 100 feet shaved off the error circle is a crew chief who did not stand alone on the tarmac. There is a temptation to call it a miracle, to pretend that some hidden gear inside the bombsight finally woke up and remembered how to save them. But they know better. The change came from discipline and doctrine, from choosing to aim where the wind would carry the bomb instead of where pride said the target ought to be. It came from one decision repeated until it became culture. Outside, the winter sky clears for a moment, and the moon climbs over the hard stands. He steps into the cold and looks along the line of fortresses, their noses pointed east like patient animals. In his pocket rests the shard of the old cracked lens, cool as a coin. He holds it to the light and sees the fracture throw a thin bar across the ground. An accidental protractor, a memory of the angle that changed everything. Tomorrow the sortie board will fill again. Pins will move. Fuel trucks will hiss. Armorers will load steel by the ton. The wind will do what it always does. And because of a choice they made and remade, the math will do what it did not do before. The numbers will hold. The circle will stay small. Men will come home. The war ended, but the mathematics refused to stop. What had begun as an accident over Schweinfurt became the grammar of every bomber that followed. When the smoke cleared, the same men who had learned to aim sideways found themselves rewriting the manuals for a new kind of peace, one that lived beneath the shadow of total destruction. In 1946, the United States Army Air Forces became the Strategic Air Command. Its creed was deterrence, but its method was geometry. The new B-52s, sleek and silver, carried the same invisible triangles once scratched on classroom chalkboards in England. Offset angles and wind vectors turned into radar corrections and inertial navigation. The principle did not age, it only changed instruments. Inside the cockpit of a jet bomber, the window was gone, the world reduced to dials and glowing scopes. Yet the ghost of the Bombsight remained. A small cursor moving across a circular screen, seeking alignment with a target that could no longer be seen. Crews practiced blind runs over the Arctic, plotting imaginary cities across polar ice. The offset calculations that once guided iron bombs now directed megaton payloads. The arithmetic of survival had expanded into policy. A single degree of error meant thousands of miles at intercontinental range. The same discipline that once saved crews from Flak now guarded the fragile balance of deterrence. Precision was no longer measured in feet or seconds, but in the cold assurance that the line of aim would never have to be used. One retired bombardier, now an instructor at Offutt Air Force Base, kept a relic on his desk, a shard of the old cracked lens. Students asked why he never replaced it. He would lift it to the light and say, "This is what taught us humility. The wind always has a say." They laughed politely, not understanding that he meant every word. The perfection of machines had grown immense, but the lesson from that fracture, that error can teach, still haunted the math. The crack that once lined up with the wind now lined up with history itself, cutting across decades of technology without ever closing. And somewhere in that thin line of glass, you could still trace the shape of a drifting bomb over Germany. And the beginning of an idea that changed how mankind aimed at anything. Decades later, the sky looks cleaner, digital, efficient, and silent. The cockpits glow with screens instead of glass, and no one wipes frost from a sight anymore. Yet the principle remains, hiding beneath layers of software and silicon. Even in an age ruled by satellites, the wind still waits to remind pilots that precision begins where faith in the machine ends. At Nellis and Anderson, new generations of crews train under blackout drills. They call it manual offset navigation. GPS signals are jammed, satellite links silenced, and the flight computers blink into confusion. What remains are compasses, inertial readings, and memory. The old trio that once guided men through flak and cloud. On radar displays, the instructors overlay the same triangles drawn in chalk 80 years before. Wind vector, track line, offset aim. In the cockpit of a stealth bomber, a pilot traces his finger across the digital map, dragging a line a mile away from the target icon. He doesn't call it art, but that's what it is. Geometry turned into instinct. The path on his screen looks wrong, yet feels right. When the bomb leaves the bay, the computer calculates a gentle curve back toward truth, offset by design, corrected by the wind. Far away, drone operators watch their own feeds stutter in the static of electronic war. For a heartbeat, they lose GPS lock and the world on their monitors slides sideways. Then the correction algorithms kick in, ancient logic wrapped in modern code. A gift from the men who first aimed at nothing and struck everything. Somewhere in the archives of the Air Force Museum rests a relic under glass, the cracked sight from Schweinfurt. Tourists pass it without noticing. A child stops, tilts her head, and asks her father what it is. He says, "A bomb sight from World War II." She studies the fracture for a long moment, the way light bends across it. "It looks," she says softly, "like it's showing the wind." The father nods, unsure why the words sound so true. Outside, a training jet passes overhead, leaving a clean white line that curls slightly east. The sky answers in its old language, silent, invisible, certain. The technology has changed, but the lesson has not. Perfection is never found in resisting the air, only in understanding it. And as long as there is wind to move a falling bomb, or bend a signal through the atmosphere, the world will still belong to those who remember how to aim sideways.